Welcome everybody to Season 1, Episode 1 of Workplace Therapy. I'm your host, Scott Arietta, and with me today are Dr. Sarah Gould and Skylar Lewandowski. And today we're going to be discussing a topic that's of particular relevance in the workplace today, which is trust and psychological safety.
Scott, I'm curious, when you brought this topic up to us, I know Skylar and I got really excited just to dig into it, but how did you find this? Because I know we had talked about trust, but this idea of psychological safety, where did you find the article? How did this come up? What was that like?
Well, as you guys know, and I'll let the audience a little bit into the conversation, we're developing signature training programs for leadership development. And the one concept that we kept coming back to consistently was the idea that effective leaders cultivate trust and psychological safety amongst not only their teams, but their peers and the organization at large. And so we knew, and we had the conviction that trust and psychological safety was probably the single biggest differentiator between effective leaders and people who just have titles of leadership. But in the conversations that we ended up having with prospects and clients, what I found is the camp is pretty divided between people who are in the choir. They believe in trust and psychological safety wholeheartedly, and they recognize the value that it brings to an organization. And then there are those people who think that trust, along with other concepts like humility and vulnerability, are actually signs of weakness and deficiency in leaders. And it's kind of this woo-woo, unnecessary, highly polished version of what work has become that's not hardcore enough for businesses that are really serious about driving business performance. And of course, spoiler alert, the people in this room are in the camp that trust and psychological safety are actually the key to catalyzing superior business performance and sustaining it over time. And we're going to go into a lot more of specifically how, when done right, creating a culture of trust and psychological safety drives these outcomes. But there's a little bit of preaching and evangelizing that we need to do for the unbelievers in the audience. And so I'm hoping that the perspectives and experiences that we all bring to the table today help to kind of unlock some learnings for people who are not quite sure what it is, how it's implemented, and why it's valuable.
And I know in the article, the author had discussed kind of the definition. Do you have that, Scott?
Yeah, so that's a great place to start the conversation, is what exactly is psychological safety. And so this actually comes from an article that was published in the Harvard Business Review by an author by the name of Amy Gallo, titled, very appropriately, "What is Psychological Safety?" And the definition that the author proposes, which I think is clean and elegant, is that, hold on. Let me find it here. Team psychological safety is a shared belief held by the members of a team that it's okay to take risks, to express their ideas and concerns, to speak up with questions, and to admit mistakes. All in all, it's without fear of negative consequences, which I think is super important. And there's a lot to unpack there. But I'm interested, Skylar, how did you feel when you heard that definition? Do you feel like that's comprehensive, or in your experience, is there more to it than that?
I think it's a very clean definition. I really liked the aspects of expressing your ideas without the fear of negative consequences. I think we all know that at work we will make mistakes, we will disagree with other people, but it's really important that if I do disagree with you, Scott, or with you, Sarah, that you're not going to immediately fire me from this podcast. And I think a lot of us are always in fear of that stability of the job or stability of our performance reviews. And so I really like the piece about psychological safety being okay to express your ideas without fear of, super negative consequences, if that makes sense. But I mean, Sarah, I was interested because I know that you've done so many coaching with individuals who are managers, who are in leadership. How does this I mean, why is it important to them?
Yeah, I would say, and I say this jokingly a little bit, but it really is a do or die situation. And I mean that wholeheartedly. When Scott talked about this being the foundation of what really unlocks a business when they're focused on revenue, the unintended consequences is they don't get revenue. But when they're focused on these foundational things that some people call soft, but are actually the hard skills, that's when they see revenue just unbelievable. If teams don't feel safe, it's this idea of they go fast to go slow. And that's why you see so many like tech startups. And I know, Scott, you have a ton of experience with this. Like they burn out so quickly. It's like, oh my gosh, this tech startup, so cool. All these investors have given them millions of dollars, and then they fizzle out. But when you actually like dig, there's this tool called the 5 whys. When you actually dig and find the root cause, it's the psychological safety. It's the trust. If that did not exist, or it's not in the forefront of the founders and the board members' minds, it destroys a company from the inside out. Because it's in operation, psychological safety is in operation whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. So in my experience, it is neglectful and you burn out as a company, not just as a leader, if you don't recognize that it's a huge contributing factor to your longevity. And I say that go slow to go fast because that's exactly what you need to do. It feels like you're slowing down when you have these conversations and you take time to build the trust and you take time to create. I know in the article they talked about normalizing vulnerability, which I love. But that's exactly what happens. When you normalize vulnerability, it is an intentional slow to fast. You build longevity, you build revenue over time. I'm curious, Scott. So I mentioned startups, and Scott has had a lot of experience consulting and working at startups at really top tier levels. Do you find that to be true? The ones that really struggle, are they focused more on, revenue than this aspect of safety and trust, or do you think it's necessary?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are so many places that I could take that. But to answer your question succinctly, in both my examples of high trust environments and examples of low trust environments, the common thread is that the presence of trust and psychological safety at the cultural level is the key differentiator between companies who succeed and are and thrive versus companies that struggle. And what's so sad to see is that for the companies that end up struggling, they're bewildered by what's happening because in their mind, they're focused solidly on what is core and primary to their business, which is revenue and profitability and cost efficiency. And we're not encumbered by worrying about this really foofy, woke BS that, that a lot of other companies like focus on, right? And so there's almost like this sense of pride and certainty that a rejection of these quote unquote softer skills actually makes them more hardcore and therefore more worthy of eventual business success. And what they don't see is the myriad of ways in which it's actually standing in direct opposition to their success. And then on the flip side, the companies that prioritize trust and psychological safety are the ones where innovation just seems to come easier. They're not encumbered by a ton of group conflict. There's not a lot of politicization of things at the corporate level. There's not a lot of like jockeying and scarcity mindset activities like pushing other people down to prop yourself up, right? And the incremental impact of all of those things is significant. Like that's a significant tax on the momentum of an organization. And that's why it's so fun to preach to the choir and to talk to organizations who have decided to prioritize trust and psychological safety based off of the belief that it will yield good things in the end. And lo and behold, it does. And then the companies that choose not to invest in it suffer the consequences and live their lives in disbelief that why is this just not working out? Why aren't we able to galvanize hearts and minds and point people in a singular direction? And eventually what ends up happening is they, quote unquote, motivate their people through really kind of austere and fear-based tactics. And that's really what creates this cascade of workplace trauma that we're seeing dominate a lot of the organizational landscape these days. And it's really a shame because there's a better way in which people will feel more fulfilled and engaged and validated, and the results will come as well. It actually reminds me of the author of this article told a really great story about how she was charged with leading a project or initiative. That initiative was coming in short of its objective. And her stomach was in knots because she had to face her boss and give her boss a status update on where the project was, and the news was not good. And so she had spent a ton of time preparing and thinking of possible answers or rationalizations for every common objection. And she was so anxious about it. And finally goes to her boss's office, has her one-on-one, reads her in on how the project is progressing, gives her the bad news. And instead of acting reactively or in a really disappointed way, her boss says to her, "So what have you learned?" And I think that story is so interesting to me because it demonstrates how simple and small gestures can be that have huge impacts from a trust and psychological safety perspective. Because in just those few words, what her boss was communicating to her is that, look, you took a swing, you missed it. It is only not redeemable if you haven't learned anything from it, right? And the implication in that statement is that, like, I'm not going to fire you because of this. It isn't over, right? I don't think that you're intrinsically less valuable as a human being. Everybody makes mistakes. That's baked into the calculus. What have you learned from it? How is it going to make you better? And I think leaders and organizations today are so short-sighted. We don't have a tolerance for mistakes. I was watching a TikTok the other day. This is a weird source of inspiration, but it was an individual contributor who had started working for this big company, and in the orientation for this big company, the training facilitator said, "Mistakes are inevitable, but not acceptable." And I feel like that's just, many companies wouldn't be so on the nose to say it exactly in that way, but that's what they're all thinking. It's like, we recognize that you're humans and that you're fallible and that we're going to make mistakes, but also never, ever do that, because we will fire you or write you up or lay you off, or refuse to give you a merit increase, and there's all of these consequences for not being perfect. But what that really does is it just prevents you from taking risk, from taking big swings, from innovating and iterating. And if you don't have that safety to try, you will regress to the most safe, non-controversial version of yourself. And that's just not enough to win in today's business environment. And a lot of companies are going to find that out the hard way. I don't know, Sarah, like what are your thoughts?
Well, I was just going to bring up, you mentioned, the power of the words of what did you learn? But Skylar, you and I had a offline conversation about some of the content that we were designing and developing. And so we had some questions for Scott. This was earlier this week, I don't remember. And we gave Scott feedback on this as the visionary of what we're trying to do, this work with our signature program. And rather than immediately shut down our recommendations or our thoughts, one of the powerful things, Scott, that you did that you probably weren't even aware of is you didn't actually say anything. You paused and you had this look on your face like you do literally right now, and really thought about what we shared and started to reflect on, hey, I was in my head and I've really been thinking about it this way. However, I see what you're saying, and really digesting what we were saying. And I think it was this, and Skylar, I'd love to hear what you thought about it, but I felt like it was so magical because I was like, we put ourselves out there and it ended up turning out to be this incredible conversation. And then the result of the conversation, what you came up with, Scott, was absolutely brilliant. But you didn't have to say anything at all to make us feel safe. It was just the pause you had and the genuine reflection and thought that you gave made us, at least I can speak for myself, made us feel seen and heard and like our opinion mattered. But that was, I think, a really cool experience that we as a team of 3 had. Skylar, did you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, I think it touches on a really big point of what psychological safety is not. It's not always agreeing with each other. It's not always not giving critical feedback to each other. It's allowing the space to say, hey, I have some feedback on this, or I disagree with the decision. And I'm actually a really big proponent of the disagree and commit. If you're able to kind of voice your disagreement with whatever the project is going towards, you can actually voice those emotions, get that out with your team, and then say, okay, now I understand why as a business we need to go this direction. And I'm able to actually focus on the work instead of always in the back of my mind being like, I disagree. I don't think this is the right direction. So I think it kind of allows us to release those emotions and actually focus on the work before. Scott, how did you feel you were going through when we gave you the feedback? Did you think you were being psychologically safe? Did you even think about it?
Skylar, I think that's a really great question, and I definitely want to dive into it. But before I do, I want to address something that you just said that I thought was just so profound. It's this idea of when you have trust and psychological safety, instead of carrying around a talk track internally and framing your experiences and interactions on that talk track that may or may not be true, and having it manifest in like angst and anxiety and just in other ways that are not super productive, what creating trust and psychological safety in an organizational context allows you to do is to feel comfortable voicing those things. And even if at the end of the day, the conclusion is, thanks for voicing your perspective for reasons that we don't have time to get into, or for other optimization decisions, further down the road, we're actually going to end up going in this opposite direction. That's probably not the outcome you wanted. Just the fact that you're able to have that conversation, make your perspective heard, raise the flag as to these are the downstream consequences that I can see from my seat, right? It's almost a release valve for you. It helps you to show up more authentically in your day-to-day. And, you don't kind of come to the table with this angst and anxiety that you would have had if you were just keeping it all bottled up inside. And that angst and anxiety has a real and measurable impact on the quality of work you produce, the efficiency of the work you produce, the throughput of the work you produce. And then imagine if you're in a company of 100 people where everybody is bottled up something, or 1,000 or 10,000 or even 100,000 people. That's hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars of lost productivity due to like conflict and just negative talk tracks and just a lack of ability for people to get their perspectives out there. right? And that, I think, is the power of trust and psychological safety. It's really hard to model in a financial model, but the impacts are undeniable at scale. So kind of taking that same idea and answering your question, Skylar. So when you and Sarah gave me feedback about how I was conducting myself, I'll give a little bit more specificity just for the listeners out there. But our team has been working on developing signature training programs for a leadership development application. One's around trust and psychological safety. Another one is just about foundational manager skills and behaviors that all managers need in order to truly galvanize their teams, win hearts and minds, and produce superior results. And I'd worked with each of you at different points in our careers. And for each of you, the context of the relationship in which we worked together was I was your direct manager. And life has brought us back into each other's lives. And we've all kind of gone our separate ways and come up with our own perspectives and education and skills. And it just so happened that we're all in a very similar place in terms of wanting to make a dent in the world by empowering leaders and teaching them how to be more effective at what they do. Right. And so we came together with this idea of developing signature training programs together. And for me, the talk track that was happening in my mind was I did not want to interact with you guys in the same way that I had interacted with you earlier in your careers. Right. Earlier in your careers, I was your direct manager, but I have so much respect and appreciation for each of you and what you have done in the time since we've worked together. I didn't want to just assume that my job or contribution was to direct the output of that project. Right. I wanted to have kind of like a more kind of egalitarian view where we were all, equal contributors and I wasn't like dictating like, here's how like I want this stuff to kind of look. And the feedback that y'all gave me that Sarah presented to me is basically like, and I mean, like, correct me if I'm wrong or misstating or oversimplifying, Sarah, but it was like, we need more direction from you. Like, we need more instruction from you. We need to see your vision. And even in a world where I'm not your guys' boss, right? We are equal partners in these programs we're developing. You saw in me my strengths and abilities. You affirmed that in me. You told me that's what you needed from me. And because you had the trust in me to give me that feedback without getting a negative reaction from me, that enabled me to have more trust in you guys too. Because what I was wrestling with was feelings of non-safety, because I'm like, man, these women are so incredible. If I'm too directive with them, maybe they won't want to work with me anymore. Maybe they won't want to be a part of the team. Like, maybe this whole thing falls apart, And so I had all of these scarcity-based, fear-based thoughts that, because you gave that feedback to me, that completely evaporated and gave me the confidence that I needed to step in and contribute in the way that you guys needed me to contribute, right? So I think in that particular case study, the trust and psychological safety goes two ways. Like, Sarah, you talked about how my reaction helped you to feel more comfortable giving me that feedback. But I think it's also important that you know that you giving me that feedback made me feel more comfortable showing up in the way that's uniquely me, that you guys needed me to show up in. And it helped to unlock or unblock our productivity and our ability to move forward and get these signature training programs done.
I feel like in a way it was like you were trying to be what you thought that we would want you to be in this new space. And it activated a reminder in yourself that no, like, they want the authentic version of me to show up. But if we hadn't had that conversation, if we hadn't had that safety, I feel like the authentic version of who you are and what makes you such a great visionary that may have been delayed. Again, we would have gone fast to go slow. It would have been delayed 3 months, 6 months. And I even think the product that we come up with wouldn't have been as good. I really don't think so. Even with the great minds we have and the diverse experience, I just don't think the quality would have been there if we didn't have the conversation. It reminds me, Scott, of when this didn't go well for me as a boss, if you don't mind me sharing, because it's quite funny. I had a staff. You had mentioned, people who have staffs of 100. So I had 100 staff members. This was when I was a principal. I had opened a brand new building, got to pick out the furniture, the carpet. It's $89 million building. Hired all the staff, handpicked them. And my first 2 years, I was like, I am nailing this principal thing. And I was like, always giving them like accolades and little notes. And my husband would make fun of me because I was like writing them cards about how awesome they are at night and then putting them in their mailboxes. And I was just trying to be their friend. And I was trying to make them happy. And all the squeaky wheels who were pushing back on anything I did, I was just wanting to satisfy them. So I'd bend over, let them do whatever they were asking to do, and just try and make everyone else happy and overcompensate for that. At the end of my first year, my retention rate of staff returning was 65%, a little over half. And I was shocked because I thought, I miss popularity. Everybody loves me. Everyone's happy. Well, they weren't. And so I thought, oh, well, I just have to try harder. And so my second year, I go in. Yes, this is a disaster. So hold on to your seats. Second year, I go in and I'm like, oh, well, I have to do more. Donuts on Friday, jeans on Tuesday. Like, I'm disgusted and nauseated even thinking about these decisions I made as a young leader. And school year ends, get the contracts out, and my retention rate decreases. I did more to make people happy, and my retention rate decreased. And then I started in my head the whole blaming. Oh, well, it's them. It's their problem. It's not me. I've done everything for them. Jeans Day? Are you kidding me? No one else does that. Chocolate? What? I had spent so much money on all this like external stuff. It turns out what I was doing was I was not creating a psychologically safe environment, because what I was communicating to them without directly communicating it was suppress your emotions. I just want people to be happy. Let's just smooth it over. Let's brush it under the rug. We're a happy family. You hear that a lot. We're a family here. I was totally that leader. And I had not realized that what I was doing was suppressing their vulnerability, suppressing their risk-taking, suppressing their emotions. I was not allowing them to push back because it didn't feel good. And that epiphany, I mean, think about how much money that cost in recruiting people, all of the training, everybody. I mean, I was bleeding. My return on investment was very low my first 2 years. Third year go in, I have this epiphany. I realize I've not created a safe environment. So I go in and I start being really honest with people. And I say, like, I was in my head, push back. These are just my ideas. What do you think? Listening more than I speak, which was hard for me because I'm a blabbermouth. So really being intentional about listening. And what I started to see over the first, quarter is people started doing that with each other. And the second thing I did is people that were whining and complaining about every little thing, I pushed back on them. I wasn't afraid to disagree. I wasn't afraid to take risks as a leader, and they respected me more. And guess what happened? Their frequency and duration of coming and visiting my office decreased significantly. The 3 years after I had done this, I had 100% of my staff return. My staff retention was so high that I had staff from other schools in the district asking to come to my building because something was happening there that was special. And I truly believe I didn't have a name for it, which is why this podcast is so powerful, because we're naming it. But what I had done is create psychological safety, because what I thought was safety actually broke us.
I love that story for so many reasons, but the thing that stood out the most to me is how the environment of psychological safety that you created and the ways that you articulated that you created it are probably not what most people would think of are ways to create psychological safety. So, for example, you mentioned pushing back on people as one of the ways that you created psychological safety, right? And obviously, there's ways of pushing back that make people feel really invalidated and really stupid and really ashamed. And I've worked with you long enough to know that that's not your style. But you do have this very authentic and organic style that is honoring and affirming of people's capabilities, experiences, and perspectives, but is still very much, and we are going to do it this way. And can I challenge you to think about it this way? Or have you considered this piece? And taking people along for the ride and helping to explain why the optimal course of action might not be what you have in mind, this other person, but is actually the best way to proceed. And that productive conflict, that calibration of ideas, you can only calibrate if you have differing perspectives and you're bringing them into closer alignment. And what does calibration do? It creates more trust. It creates more alignment. It creates an environment where y'all are incrementally getting closer to understanding each other's thought processes and perspectives. And all of those are investments in efficiency in high performing teams, right? And I think a lot of people, when they think about psychological safety, like what they think about is no conflict whatsoever, a conflict-free work environment where nobody is challenged because being challenged is uncomfortable. And what psychological safety is not, it is not creating an environment where everybody is comfortable and nice 100% of the time. It's like more important for you to be authentic and real. Clear is kind, Brene Brown would say, and I think like you in particular model that behavior really nicely. And that's one of the harder things to master as a leader, because I think it's very common for leaders to either become people pleasers and to not be clear and to be inauthentic. And they end up causing a lot of hurt and a lot of trauma because people think that they think certain things that is not necessarily representative of what they actually think or believe. And then on the flip side, you have people who swing the pendulum the other way and they become autocratic and they lead out of fear and positional authority, right? And those people are definitely not creating psychological safety, but for more obvious kind of reasons. And so really the leader that thrives in creating trust is a leader who's really mastered the nuance of these soft skills. And I put that in air quotes. Skylar, you were vigorously head nodding there as like Sarah was talking. Do you have any insights from your own experience on psychological safety and when it was done well or maybe not so well?
Yeah, I mean, I loved Sarah's story and how just making people happy is definitely not creating an environment where people can speak up, because then that does tell people, okay, whatever I say, I should try to make other people happy too, which doesn't bring up things that you should inevitably look out for in projects long term. I think when I think about my own psychologically like safe environment, the whole hybrid remote setting comes up to me a lot in these past couple of years. And I can share kind of my experience, and I would love to hear your perspectives on like how this shows up when we're actually working apart and not in the same location. And it was interesting because I started a job during the pandemic, so everybody was remote, and I felt really trusted. I felt, applauded for overcoming any kind of operational issues or situational issues that I had to deal with. My manager at the time, she kept reminding me like to speak up, and I was able to kind of give my feedback during that time, and I felt really psychologically safe when everybody was remote. Then the pandemic kind of winded down, and the company decided that the pandemic was basically over, and so they had everybody come back into the office. And I was still dealing with some home issues with the pandemic, and so I wanted to keep working hybrid. And that's when I started to feel less psychologically safe. I felt when there was a difference between the people working in the office and the people working at home, I wasn't able to speak up as much. And I still haven't fully unpacked like why that difference was. But I think it's really critical now that we figure it out, because so many companies are doing hybrid work. And it's really tough, I think, to have psychological safety when half the people are in the office and then half the people are remote. So Scott or Sarah, I would love to kind of understand your experience during this pandemic and how you cultivated that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, Skylar, what you pointed out there, because it certainly is. That dynamic is certainly in the spotlight given return to office, hybrid work environments, remote work environments. Organizations are experiencing this at a large scale where they've never really had to confront these ideas of how do you engage employees across multiple workplace contexts in a way that creates trust, psychological safety, team cohesion, alignment with mission, vision, and values. Like, these are really big problems that, quite frankly, most organizations don't have the muscle memory yet to kind of implement effectively. But even before this march towards remote and flexible work, what your examples brought up for me, Skylar, are like experiences that I had early in my career. So I grew up at a large financial services company that the primary headcount base was on the East Coast, and I was located here on the West Coast in one of their satellite offices. And one of the common complaints that we here on the West Coast often surfaced was there didn't seem to be a lot of empathy, appreciation, visibility for the uniqueness of the employment experience here on the West Coast, where we're separated from what we called the mothership on the East Coast, right? And all it would have really taken is an investment in understanding the workplace experiences, how they differed, how we can create communities across geographical boundaries. How can we be more intentional about creating opportunities for teams from different locations to work more closely together, build those relationships? And how can we leverage technology in ways that is strategic to forming those relationships? But then, to your point, Skylar, also, how do we create an awareness and sensitivity to the level of engagement that we are or are not getting from our employees who are primarily not on site, right? How do we make them feel in a truly genuine and authentic way that their perspectives are still valuable, that their contributions are still more than just the output of their work, right? That they are still a human being living in community with the rest of the human beings in the organization. And I think the answers are there, and they'll be different for every organization in their operational context. But I don't think that enough companies are spending time thinking about that as a problem to be solved. I think they naively think this is a scheduling problem and not a holistic employee engagement problem.
I also think that psychological safety was important before, but during the pandemic and post-pandemic, if it was important before, it should be the most important thing now. Because when you have people operating out of literal different spaces that you can't control their work environment. what tools they have access to, their frequency of breaks, everything, their workspace, how they show up in their office, what their office looks like, their accessibility to technology and tools, their transportation. When you don't have control over that anymore, that psychological safety actually becomes more important than it was before. And if we know that research tells us that psychological safety is the underpinning of workplace longevity, increased retention rates, increased revenue, decrease in absenteeism, that was happening before the pandemic, before we had these hybrid remote situations. To Skylar's point, if she suddenly has to go hybrid and there's this some are in the office, some are not, is it okay to not be in the office? Is there special treatment for people who are closer to what you said, Scott, the mothership? If we aren't making an intentional effort to build psychological safety, if we're not naming it and then naming what we're doing to support each of those work situations, work environments, whether it's the folks working from home, hybrid, or the people that choose to go in the office every day, that what Skylar experienced is exactly what will happen to your people. And then what do you get? You get burnout, you get turnover, you get decreases in revenue. You have to spend more time recruiting. You have to spend more time on healthcare benefits because when people aren't happy, their health isn't good, and so you think about these long-term impacts, and to be honest, a lot of them aren't even long-term. You start to see them immediately. I like to think about the service industry. Like, all of us have gone out and, ordered food or, gone to a farmer's market or had some kind of experience. And you can tell when people feel really good about coming to work. And I know both of you can name, and listeners, you can name when you go into, let's just say, a restaurant and it's a sit down, you can tell how the employees are treated by the way they treat you. Immediately, you can feel it. They don't even have to say anything. You just walk in and you know. And the food could be incredible, really well done, great chef, great ingredients. But if your service doesn't feel authentic and happy and meaningful, that energy just comes across, and the food, it doesn't matter how good the food is, it doesn't taste good. Now you go into the same restaurant, say it's a chain, but the people are happy and they're genuine and they're talking to each other. The servers are going back and forth and cracking jokes and the atmosphere feels good. How do you think that food tastes? Same exact food, but the food's going to taste better in the environment where people feel safe. So, same product, same table, same atmosphere, same decor, same principles, same philosophy. One feels psychologically safe, one doesn't. What restaurant do you think is going to produce more revenue and have a longer wait list? It's going to be the restaurant where people feel safe.
It's so true. It's so true. Like, I love that example because I think it really illustrates well how there's a trickle down effect. There's a multiplicative effect from creating an environment of trust and psychological safety. And the impact that you feel is exponential, right? Because it's, leaders who feel empowered to lead from a place of trust and vulnerability, create teams who surface more feedback, and that surfacing of feedback and the ability to internalize it without feeling personally attacked breeds growth and innovation. And so there's this flywheel of producing better products and better service and better outcomes. And then, to your point, Sarah, and you're speaking my language, it's that the customers feel that too. And the thing with the customers is the experiences that you create for them, Net Promoter Score research has also shown, has an exponential impact on referrals and the ability to acquire and retain new customers, right? So this idea, especially now in the internet age, of authentic reviews and referrals and how much of a driver that is for new product or new service discovery, you can only create that enthusiasm around your product or service if you've got your house in order internally. Because to your point, the consumers will feel it if you're not creating that environment for your employees. And it's going to show up in crappy quality, and it's going to show up in lack of productivity, which might mean long wait times or product delays and things like that. And so it's probably more important than we can really accurately convey, because its tendrils of the impacts are everywhere in your organization. And most companies, I don't think, treat it with the level of urgency and importance that it deserves to be. So that actually feeds into our next point here, which is why is it important? We've talked about this in the context of a couple of examples so far, but when done well, trust and psychological safety drives innovation, productivity, and growth. And there was actually a story, and it kind of dovetails into what we were just talking about, but there's a story in the article where the author says that to her surprise, she was studying reported errors in teams that had high psychological safety and teams that had low psychological safety. And to her surprise, the teams with higher psychological safety had way more errors reported, right? And on its face, if you stop the questions there, Sarah, if you didn't engage in your 5 whys, and you were a non-believer in trust and psychological safety, you'd be like, aha, see, I knew it. I knew that the emphasis on these like foofy soft skills behaviors really is fundamentally not good for business. Like if you just crack the whip and don't tolerate errors, we'll get fewer defects. But that's not what was really happening under the hood. What was happening under the hood was these teams that had higher psychological safety actually felt more empowered to report their defects, right? And because they reported them, you can now do something about them. So that drives quality. You're not letting a product with shit quality go out the door, right? But it also drives innovation. Like we're seeing these problems consistently. How do we nip it off at the bud so that we're not exposed to these problems in the future? And how many organizations out there have low trust, low psychological safety? They're self-reporting on their quality, but people are just terrified to actually surface the truth. And because of that, they're letting low quality products go out the door. And those low quality products are ending up in the hands of customers. And those customers are becoming detractors, and they're spreading their experience to people who would potentially be new customers. But now, because of a very persuasive negative experience that's all over social media, they will never, ever try your service. And if they did, it's a crapshoot whether or not your service would be worth trying anyway, because your teams aren't reporting the defects. You're not figuring out what the problems are. You're not addressing them. And the negative cycle just continues.
Well, I actually have a question based off of what you guys were saying is, can companies that are purely results focused have psychological safety? And this kind of brought up to your point of the teams that had psychologically safety reported more errors in their work. So technically their results weren't as good as the team that didn't have psychologically safe environments to work in. And I remember in one of my performance reviews hearing, it doesn't matter how hard they worked, and they were talking about another team. It doesn't matter how hard they worked. They didn't make it happen. So we can't give them a good performance review. And it was interesting. Like I struggle with this idea of like, can companies have this pure mindset of being results focused, not caring about any externalities that happen? Can they also have psychologically safe environments to work in?
I think it goes down to the team. So can you work for a company that is only driven by revenue and be successful? Yeah. if you have the right team. And I think the author mentions that as well, is that if you have a team that is just absolutely incredible and able to execute and has psychological safety, can they operate inside of a company who's driven by revenue? Yes. However, I think there's a lot of factors that have to be in place. One is that team's leader has to have complete autonomy outside of the C-suite. Because if the C-suite is only focused on revenue and doesn't allow that team lead to do what needs to get done, then no, it can't exist. But if the C-suite is like, we're focused just on revenue, that's our driver, that's all the board focuses on, but they trust the people below them to get it done however they need to get it done, I think psychological safety can be built even in its absence at the top levels. But I think that a team that does not have that present may produce revenue for a short time, but it will fizzle out. So it's kind of like this idea, the analogy of the sprint versus the marathon. So when you train for a sprint, you're focused on training for something really, really quickly from A to B in a short time frame. So you don't need a lot of supports in place or anything. It's just get it done. So in the short sprint, yeah, they might be focused on revenue and actually produce revenue without safety. But most companies operate as a marathon, which is pacing themselves, developing these standards of trust over time. And I feel like if a company does not have those things in place, what happens to them in a marathon? They can't get past the first event. They do great. They might kill it on their first event, but it's not built to last.
I think that's a really great point that you bring up, Sarah, about this difference between the long-term lens and the short-term lens. And I mean, where I might push back a little bit is I actually think it's rare to find companies that are brave enough to navigate with a long-term lens. And if you think about the way that corporations here in America are set up, like whether you're talking about startups or publicly traded companies, there is a short-term focus incentive for both of those operating contexts, right? So I'll talk about startups for a bit. In the startup land, and it really shouldn't be this way, but I think like one of the trends that has kind of pervaded venture-funded startups is that the founders, the venture capitalists, everybody who's backing the startup idea is oriented towards how do we demonstrate proof of concept and scale this to the point where we are ready for an exit as quickly as possible, right? And if you are gearing yourself towards an exit, then what happens is you start cutting corners and you start caring less and less about the trail of dead bodies that you leave in your wake, right? And so I think that's why you hear a ton of these horrific stories from the startup world, because you have this really potent combination of really bad things. So you have what tend to be fairly inexperienced founders who don't have a ton of leadership ability, but were visionaries who had a really disruptive idea that they codified into a pitch deck and started talking to venture capitalists about trying to get money to get their idea off the ground. And then the VCs buy into their brilliance and write big checks, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. And so now you have somebody with limited experience, with a whole lot of money, ready to make a ton of mistakes, and you're the guinea pig if you choose to work in this environment. And it's a crapshoot. Like, there are some founders that come into it understanding and believing in the value of trust, psychological safety, great leadership, good culture, and they build their business plan around that. And I've been fortunate enough to work for a few CEOs in the startup context who are that way. And they've built amazing, enduring brands that I am proud to have been affiliated with. But unfortunately, by the numbers, the reality of my experience has been that there's a short-term incentive and a short-term focus that causes a whole lot of harm organizationally. And that's why you hear all these stories in the startup context. But does it get any better when you get to become a public company? I would argue probably not, because now instead of the acquisition or IPO cycle, the exit cycle, you've got the quarterly shareholder meeting cycle, right? And the things that shareholders reward you for are things like top line revenue and profitability and new user growth and all of these things that are very superficial. They tell a very shallow part of the story. And the whole narrative might not be apparent in 1 or 2 quarters. It might take multiple quarters or multiple years for something to actually take root. And but the cycle with which we place ourselves under accountability is the thing that narrows our focus. And so we're running up on time for this episode. There's a lot more to talk about in a part 2. And so I think we'll stop the conversation here for today. But before I do, the thing that I'll say that we'll pick up again in episode 2 is this idea, Skylar, that is it possible for results-oriented organizations to have trust and psychological safety? My answer to you would be yes. My caveat to you would be it depends on what you define as a result. And so I think that's a good place for us to pick up the next episode. So for you listeners there, thank you for spending some time with us here on our first episode. We'll be continuing the conversation on trust and psychological safety in episode 2, and I hope to see you all then.